A champagne glass slipped from my fingers, shattering against the marble floor of the grand ballroom. Every conversation in the room seemed to stop at once. 200 pairs of eyes turned toward me, and in that moment, I felt smaller than I had in years. This was supposed to be my moment of triumph, but instead I was standing in a puddle of expensive champagne, watching my former colleagues whisper behind their hands. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Little did they know, in exactly 37 minutes, Mayor Catherine Brennan would step up to that microphone and change everything. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks earlier, embossed with gold lettering on cream-colored cardstock. Mitchell and Associates Law Firm 25th Anniversary Celebration. Below it, in elegant script, join us for an evening of celebration at the Riverside Grand Ballroom. I'd stared at that invitation for a full 10 minutes, my coffee growing cold on my kitchen counter. Mitchell and Associates, the firm where I'd given 7 years of my life, working 60-hour weeks, taking on the cases nobody else wanted, staying late to research obscure legal precedents, while the partners went home to their suburban mansions. The firm that had unceremoniously let me go 8 months ago. Downsizing, Richard Mitchell had said, not even having the courtesy to meet my eyes. Nothing personal, Thompson. Just business. Nothing personal. As if the sleepless nights I'd spent on the Hartwell merger meant nothing. As if the pro bono work I'd done for the homeless shelter was just a line item to be erased. But I'd kept the invitation. Maybe it was masochism. Or maybe it was curiosity about what I'd left behind. Either way, when Saturday evening came, I found myself standing in front of my closet, pulling out my best navy suit, the one I'd worn to court victories, the one that still smelled faintly of the expensive cologne I used to wear when I thought appearances mattered. The Riverside Grand Ballroom lived up to its name. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over polished marble floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered a spectacular view of the Potomac River. White-gloved waiters moved through the crowd carrying silver trays of hors d'oeuvres, and a string quartet played softly in the corner. This was exactly the kind of event Richard Mitchell loved: ostentatious, expensive, designed to impress potential clients and remind everyone of the firm's success. I'd barely made it through the entrance when I spotted familiar faces. There was Jennifer Walsh from the litigation department, her red hair swept up in an elaborate updo, laughing with clients I recognized from the Henderson case. Near the bar, I saw Marcus Rodriguez, who'd started at the firm the same week I did. He was wearing a new Rolex, I noticed. Apparently business was good. For a moment, I considered turning around and leaving. This had been a mistake. But before I could make my escape, Jennifer spotted me. Daniel? Daniel Thompson? She approached with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I didn't expect to see you here, Jennifer. I managed what I hoped was a confident smile. You look wonderful. How's the Henderson appeal going? Her smile faltered slightly. Oh, that. Well, Marcus took over after you left. We settled out of court last month. She glanced around nervously. I should really get back to the Hendersons. They're here tonight, you know. Big donors to the firm now. She was gone before I could respond, leaving me standing alone near a marble pillar. The message was clear. I no longer belonged here. The pattern repeated itself throughout the evening. Former colleagues would approach with forced pleasantries, make uncomfortable small talk for exactly 90 seconds, then excuse themselves to find more important people to schmooze with. It was like watching a choreographed dance, one I was no longer part of. Thompson. Richard Mitchell himself appeared at my elbow, his booming voice carrying across the room. He looked exactly the same, silver hair perfectly styled, expensive suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, that politician's smile he'd perfected over 25 years of practice. Didn't think we'd see you tonight, Richard. I shook his offered hand, noting how his grip was just a fraction too firm, a power play he'd probably learned in law school. Congratulations on 25 years. Thank you. Thank you. He gestured broadly at the opulent surroundings. Not bad for a kid from Baltimore, right? You know, we've had our best year ever. The firm expanded into 3 new practice areas, bringing on 6 new associates. Growth, Thompson. That's what it's all about. The subtext was obvious. They were thriving without me, possibly because of my absence. That's great news, I managed. And what about you? His eyes glittered with what might have been genuine curiosity or cruel satisfaction. Hanging out your own shingle? Solo practice keeps you busy. The truth was more complicated than he knew. After leaving Mitchell and Associates, I'd spent 2 months in a dark spiral of self-doubt and rejection letters. The legal market in DC was cutthroat, and having terminated on your employment record, even for downsizing, was like wearing a scarlet letter to job interviews. But I'd clawed my way back. Started taking court-appointed cases, defending people who couldn't afford the Mitchell and Associates of the world. The pay was terrible, the hours were long, and I was working out of a cramped office above a coffee shop in Capitol Hill. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was actually practicing law instead of just billing hours. I'm keeping busy, I said simply. Richard nodded, but I could see he'd already lost interest. His attention had shifted to someone behind me, probably a potential client with deeper pockets. Well, good luck with whatever it is you're doing now. He clapped me on the shoulder with false bonhomie. Enjoy the party, and then he was gone, drawn away by the gravitational pull of money and influence. I found myself gravitating toward the bar, partly for the alcohol but mostly because it was one of the few places where I could stand without looking completely lost. The bartender, a young woman with kind eyes, poured me a whiskey without my asking. "Rough night?" she asked quietly. "Something like that." From my position at the bar, I had a perfect view of the room's social dynamics. The partners held court near the windows, surrounded by their most important clients. The associates clustered in the middle, networking frantically, hoping tonight might be the night they impressed the right person. And scattered throughout were the hangers-on, the clients' spouses, local politicians, business leaders who might someday need legal services. I recognized most of the faces, but I wasn't part of any of the groups anymore. I was a ghost at my own funeral, watching the firm that had once defined my identity celebrate its continued existence without me. The whiskey burned, but it was a good burn. That's when Mayor Catherine Brennan walked through the door. She was hard to miss, not because of her height or her presence, though she had both, but because conversations seemed to pause as she moved through the room. Brennan had been mayor for 6 years now, and she'd earned a reputation as someone who got things done. Urban renewal projects, infrastructure improvements, bringing new businesses to the city. She was the kind of politician who actually delivered on campaign promises. She was also, I'd heard through the legal gossip mill, looking for a new city attorney. The previous one had resigned in scandal 3 months ago, something about misappropriated funds and a very messy divorce. The position had been temporarily filled by a deputy, but everyone knew Brennan was conducting a quiet search for someone permanent. Richard Mitchell materialized beside the mayor, like he'd been summoned by radar. Within minutes, she was surrounded by the firm's partners, all of them no doubt pitching their services for various city contracts. Municipal law was a lucrative business, and Mitchell and Associates had been hungry for that particular pie for years. I was watching this political theater unfold when I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned around to find Sarah Chen, the firm's former paralegal, standing behind me with 2 champagne flutes. Her face was flushed, and I could tell she'd already had a few drinks. "Daniel Thompson, as I live and breathe." She handed me one of the glasses. "You know, you're either very brave or very stupid for showing up here tonight." Sarah had always been direct. It's what made her such a good paralegal and such terrible company at firm parties. She'd left Mitchell and Associates about 6 months before I was terminated, taking a position at the district attorney's office. "Probably stupid," I admitted, accepting the champagne. "How are things at the DA's office?" "Busy, fulfilling. It pays about half what this place did, but I actually sleep at night now." She gestured around the room. "Look at them all, Daniel. Still playing the same games, still kissing the same asses. Some things never change." "Some things do," I said, watching Richard Mitchell lean in close to Mayor Brennan, no doubt sharing some carefully rehearsed anecdote about his firm's community involvement. Sarah followed my gaze. "Ah yes, the mayor. Word is she's looking for a new city attorney. Every firm in town is circling like vultures." She lowered her voice. "Between you and me, she's not impressed with the usual suspects. I want someone with actual trial experience, someone who's worked with real people instead of just corporate clients. Before I could ask what she meant by that, Sarah was pulled away by her date, a tall man I didn't recognize who introduced himself as a federal prosecutor. They drifted toward the dance floor, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the growing certainty that I should have stayed home. The evening wore on. I made awkward conversation with a few more former colleagues, endured several thinly veiled comments about my career change, and watched the firm's partners work the room like seasoned politicians. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd helped build this machine, contributed to its success, and now I was watching it from the outside. Around 9 o'clock, things took an interesting turn. I was standing near the windows, pretending to admire the view of the river, when I overheard a heated conversation between two of the firm's junior partners, Kevin Walsh and Patricia Hoffman. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I'm telling you, it's a disaster waiting to happen, Patricia was saying, her voice tight with stress. The Meridian case is falling apart. We're looking at potential sanctions, maybe even a malpractice suit. Kevin glanced around nervously. Keep your voice down. If Richard finds out we screwed up the discovery phase, we didn't screw it up, Johnson did. But guess who's going to take the fall when the client realizes we missed 18 months of crucial documents? The Meridian case. I remembered it well. A complex environmental lawsuit involving a chemical plant and groundwater contamination. The client, Meridian Industries, was being sued by 3 different community groups, and the case hinged on demonstrating that the company had followed all EPA regulations. It was exactly the kind of high-stakes litigation that Mitchell and Associates loved, with fees that could easily reach 7 figures. It was also the case I'd been working on when I was terminated. Maybe we should tell Richard tonight, Kevin was saying. Get ahead of it before. Are you insane? This is the firm's anniversary party. Half our biggest clients are here. We tell him Monday morning, and pray we can figure out a solution over the weekend. They moved away before I could hear more, but I'd heard enough. The Meridian case was imploding, and it sounded like someone had made a critical error in the discovery process, the phase where both sides exchange relevant documents and evidence. In environmental law, that kind of mistake could be catastrophic. I found myself thinking about the late nights I'd spent on that case, the meticulous document reviews, the careful coordination with Meridian's in-house counsel. I'd been building a comprehensive defense strategy when Richard called me into his office that Tuesday morning 8 months ago. A waiter appeared at my elbow with a fresh drink. Compliments of the gentleman at the bar, he said, nodding toward a man in an expensive tuxedo who raised his glass in my direction. I didn't recognize him, but his gesture seemed friendly enough. I made my way over, weaving through clusters of conversation and laughter. David Richardson, he said, extending his hand. I don't think we've met, Daniel Thompson. His handshake was firm, confident. Thanks for the drink. I heard you used to work here. Environmental law, right? Word traveled fast in legal circles. Among other things, you corporate litigation mostly. I represent Meridian Industries. He paused, studying my face. Actually, I think you worked on our case before the recent changes at the firm. Recent changes. A diplomatic way of saying before you got fired. I did some preliminary work on it, I said carefully. How's it progressing? Richardson's expression darkened. That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about. Can we step outside for a moment? Get some air? The terrace was nearly empty, just a few smokers huddled near the railing. The October night was crisp, and the lights of Georgetown twinkled across the river. Richardson lit a cigarette and offered me one, which I declined. I'm going to be direct with you, Thompson. The case is a mess. The firm missed critical deadlines, failed to produce key documents, and my client is starting to ask uncomfortable questions about their legal strategy. I kept my expression neutral. I'm not really in a position to comment on ongoing litigation. Of course not, but you know the case better than anyone. You spent months building the foundation of our defense. He took a long drag. My client is considering making a change. They're not happy with Mitchell and Associates' handling of the matter. This was dangerous territory. Even discussing it could be seen as trying to steal a client from my former firm. But Richardson seemed genuinely distressed, and I could understand why. Environmental cases were notoriously complex, and if the firm had dropped the ball on discovery, what kind of documents are we talking about? I asked. Internal memos, email chains, technical reports from 2019 and 2020, stuff that should have been produced months ago. The opposing counsel is threatening sanctions, and frankly, we might deserve them. I remembered those documents. They were part of an internal review Meridian had conducted after some community groups first raised concerns about groundwater contamination. The documents showed that the company had been proactive in addressing potential issues. They were actually helpful to our case, not damaging. But they were buried in thousands of pages of corporate records, and it took specific knowledge of Meridian's organizational structure to know where to look. Have you talked to the associates working on the case now? I asked. Richardson laughed bitterly. Associates, plural. There's one junior associate handling everything, and she's been at the firm for 6 months. She's smart enough, but she's drowning. And the partners are too busy with this party and their other high-profile cases to give her proper supervision. We stood in silence for a moment, looking out over the river. I could hear the sounds of the party drifting through the glass doors. Laughter, conversation, the clink of champagne glasses. Inside, Richard Mitchell was probably regaling Mayor Brennan with stories of the firm's successes, conveniently omitting the disasters brewing behind the scenes. I should get back inside, I said finally. Thompson. Richardson's voice stopped me at the door. If things don't improve with the current arrangement, would you be interested in discussing alternatives? The implications were clear. Meridian was considering firing Mitchell and Associates and hiring new counsel, and they were thinking about hiring me. I appreciate the confidence, I said, but that's not really how these things work. Isn't it? He flicked his cigarette over the railing. My client wants competent representation. If they can't get it from a big firm, maybe they need to look elsewhere. Back inside, the party was reaching its peak. The dance floor was crowded, the bar was doing steady business, and the conversations had grown louder and more animated. I found myself swept up in the crowd, moving through familiar faces that now seemed strange and distant. Near the main podium, I spotted Mayor Brennan engaged in an intense conversation with a woman I didn't recognize, probably one of her aides. The mayor looked serious, almost concerned, and she kept glancing at her watch. Something was clearly on her mind beyond the social pleasantries of the evening. That's when I noticed Richard Mitchell approaching the podium, a microphone in his hand and a satisfied smile on his face. The crowd began to quiet, sensing that the formal portion of the evening was about to begin. The microphone squealed with feedback, causing everyone in the ballroom to wince. Richard Mitchell adjusted it with the practiced ease of someone who'd given thousands of speeches, his silver hair gleaming under the chandeliers. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention please. The conversations died down to a murmur, then to silence. 200 faces turned toward the podium, champagne glasses suspended midway to lips, everyone settling into that polite attention reserved for mandatory speeches at formal events. 25 years ago, Richard began, his voice carrying easily across the room, I hung out my shingle in a cramped office above a delicatessen on K Street. I had no clients, no reputation, and no idea what I was doing. Polite laughter rippled through the crowd. I'd heard this speech before. Richard's humble beginnings were a favorite topic at firm retreats and client dinners. The truth was more complicated, of course. His father had been a federal judge, his mother came from old Virginia money, and that cramped office had been in one of the most expensive buildings in downtown D.C. Today, Mitchell and Associates is one of the premier law firms in the district. We represent Fortune 500 companies, handle billion-dollar mergers, and our attorneys argue cases before the Supreme Court. He paused for effect, scanning the crowd with satisfaction. But none of this would have been possible without the extraordinary team of lawyers who've made this firm what it is today. More applause. I noticed several of the current associates straightening their postures, hoping to catch Richard's eye. The partners stood near the front, basking in reflected glory. This past year has been our most successful yet. We've expanded into cybersecurity law, opened our branch office in Richmond, and brought on 6 new associates from the top law schools in the country. Richard's voice grew more animated. We've also strengthened our relationships with key clients and community partners. He gestured toward Mayor Brennan, who smiled and raised her glass slightly. We're honored to have Mayor Brennan with us tonight. Under her leadership, Our city has flourished, and Mitchell and Associates has been proud to support her administration's initiative. The mayor's smile didn't waver, but I caught something in her expression, a tightness around her eyes that suggested she had other things on her mind. She checked her watch again, a quick, almost furtive gesture. But enough about business, Richard continued. Tonight is about celebration, about recognizing the dedication and excellence that have made this firm a DC institution. He launched into a series of acknowledgments, thanking the partners for their leadership, the associates for their hard work, the support staff for keeping everything running smoothly. It was the kind of corporate cheerleading that every law firm engaged in, full of buzzwords about synergy and client service and commitment to excellence. I found my attention drifting, watching the faces in the crowd instead of listening to the words. Jennifer Walsh was nodding along enthusiastically, probably hoping for a promotion. Marcus Rodriguez looked bored, checking his phone when he thought no one was looking. Near the back of the room, I spotted Patricia Hoffman and Kevin Walsh, the two junior partners I'd overheard discussing the Meridian disaster. They both looked like they were attending their own funeral. Of course, Richard was saying, success in law isn't just about winning cases or closing deals, it's about serving the community, giving back, making our city a better place for everyone. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mitchell and Associates' idea of community service was writing a check to the United Way once a year and letting junior associates do pro bono work during their lunch breaks. I thought about the cases I'd been handling since leaving the firm, defending teenagers caught with marijuana, helping elderly tenants fight wrongful evictions, representing immigrants in deportation hearings. Real community service, the kind that didn't come with tax deductions or glowing press releases. Which brings me to a special announcement, Richard continued, and something in his tone made everyone pay closer attention. As many of you know, the city has been searching for a new attorney to replace William Carstairs, who stepped down earlier this year. A ripple of interest went through the crowd. Municipal positions like city attorney were highly coveted. They offered good salaries, excellent benefits, and the kind of public profile that could launch a political career. More importantly, the city attorney's office controlled millions of dollars in legal contracts, making it a plum assignment for any law firm. I'm pleased to announce that Mitchell and Associates has been selected to provide interim legal counsel to the city, while the search for a permanent attorney continues. Richard's smile was triumphant. This partnership represents not just a business opportunity, but a chance for our firm to serve the community in a meaningful way. The applause was enthusiastic, particularly from the firm's employees. I could see the dollar signs in their eyes. Municipal work was steady, well-paying, and relatively low risk. It was exactly the kind of client relationship that Richard had been pursuing for years. But something was wrong. Mayor Brennan wasn't applauding. She was standing perfectly still, her face a mask of polite neutrality, but her knuckles were white where she gripped her champagne glass. Her aide, a thin woman with short black hair, leaned over and whispered something urgent in her ear. The mayor's response was barely perceptible, a slight shake of her head, a tightening of her jaw. Whatever the aide had told her, it wasn't good news. Richard, oblivious to the drama unfolding just feet away from him, continued his victory speech. This partnership will allow us to bring our expertise in corporate law, environmental litigation, and municipal governance to bear on the challenges facing our city. We're committed to providing the highest level of legal representation. I stopped listening. Something was happening, something Richard didn't know about. The mayor's aide was typing furiously on her phone, her face grim. A few moments later, she showed the screen to Mayor Brennan, who read it quickly and then closed her eyes briefly, as if gathering strength for what came next. The mayor stood up. The movement was subtle at first, just a shift in her posture, a straightening of her shoulders. But gradually, conversations around her began to quiet. People noticed that she was no longer sitting in polite attention, but standing with the bearing of someone who had something important to say. Richard noticed too. His speech faltered slightly, and he glanced in her direction with a confused smile. Mayor Brennan, did you want to add something? The mayor moved toward the podium with deliberate steps. The room fell completely silent, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Richard stepped aside, still smiling but with growing uncertainty in his eyes. Mayor Brennan took the microphone and adjusted it slightly. When she spoke, her voice was clear and carried easily across the ballroom. Thank you, Mr. Mitchell, for those kind words about our city's progress. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. However, I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding regarding the city attorney position. Richard's smile froze. The crowd stirred uneasily, sensing tension. While it's true that we've been conducting a search for a new city attorney, and while we have indeed received proposals from several distinguished firms including Mitchell and Associates, no final decision has been made. Her voice was diplomatic but firm. In fact, I received some disturbing information just a few minutes ago that has significantly impacted our evaluation process. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Richard's face had gone pale, and I could see sweat beginning to form on his forehead despite the air conditioning. As you all know, the position of city attorney requires the highest levels of competence, integrity, and attention to detail. The person in this role must be someone the citizens of our city can trust completely. The mayor's eyes found Richard's. Unfortunately, recent events have raised serious questions about whether certain firms can meet these standards. I felt my heart racing. Whatever information the mayor had received, it was clearly related to the firm. And given what I'd overheard about the Meridian case earlier in the evening, I had a sinking suspicion about what kind of disturbing information she might be referring to. I don't want to get into specifics on what should be a celebratory evening, Mayor Brennan continued, but I felt it was important to clarify the situation before any misunderstandings could spread. The silence in the room was deafening. 200 people held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Richard looked like he was about to be sick. However, the mayor said, and there was something different in her tone now, something that made me pay even closer attention. I am pleased to announce that we have found our new city attorney. The crowd stirred again, confusion rippling through the room. If Mitchell and Associates wasn't getting the contract, and no decision had been made, then who? Mayor Brennan smiled for the first time since taking the microphone. The position will be filled by someone with extensive experience in environmental law, municipal governance, and community advocacy. Someone who has demonstrated both legal excellence and a genuine commitment to serving the people of this city. My mouth went dry. There was something in the way she was looking at the crowd, the way her eyes seemed to be searching for someone specific. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in congratulating our new city attorney. The world seemed to slow down. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, could feel the weight of 200 pairs of eyes, even though they weren't looking at me yet. This couldn't be happening. This was impossible. Daniel Thompson. The champagne glass slipped from my fingers. Time fractured into slow-motion fragments, the crystal tumbling through the air, catching the light from the chandeliers, hitting the marble floor with a sound like a gunshot. Champagne splashed across my shoes, across the polished stone, across the hem of Patricia Hoffman's evening gown. 200 faces turned toward me in perfect unison. I stood frozen, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Daniel Thompson. She had said Daniel Thompson, my name, from the podium, in front of everyone. Daniel. Mayor Brennan's voice cut through my paralysis. Would you please join me up here? The crowd parted like the Red Sea. Conversations had stopped mid-sentence. Champagne glasses hung suspended in mid-air, and the string quartet's music faded to an uncertain halt. I could feel every eye in the room tracking my movement as I walked toward the podium on unsteady legs. Richard Mitchell stood to the side, his face cycling through confusion, anger, and something that might have been panic. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no sound came out. Ladies and gentlemen, Mayor Brennan continued as I reached the front of the room, Daniel Thompson brings 15 years of legal experience to this position, including extensive work in environmental law, municipal regulations, and community advocacy. He's exactly the kind of attorney our city needs. The applause that followed was scattered and uncertain. Most of the people in this room had no idea who I was, just some guy who'd been standing by himself near the bar, apparently invisible until this moment. But I could see recognition dawning on familiar faces. Jennifer Walsh looked like she'd seen a ghost. Marcus Rodriguez was staring at me with his mouth slightly open. Sarah Chen, near the back of the room, was grinning like she'd just won the lottery. Mr. Thompson, the mayor said, turning to me with a warm smile, would you like to say a few words? Would I like to say a few words? I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. 3 hours ago I'd been a solo practitioner working out of a cramped office above a coffee shop. Now I was apparently the city attorney, standing in front of my former colleagues who'd spent the evening treating me like a pariah. I took the microphone with hands that I hoped weren't visibly shaking. Thank you, Mayor Brennan. I'm honored by your confidence in me. My voice sounded strange in my own ears, amplified and echoing off the marble walls. I know this comes as a surprise to many people in this room. Frankly, it comes as a surprise to me too. Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. I could see David Richardson near the back, raising his glass with a knowing smile. Suddenly his conversation on the terrace made perfect sense. He hadn't just been complaining about Mitchell and Associates' handling of the Meridian case. He'd been testing me, evaluating me, maybe even recommending me. The position of city attorney is one of enormous responsibility, I continued, finding my rhythm. It requires someone who understands that law isn't just about billable hours or corporate profits. It's about serving people, protecting communities, and ensuring that justice isn't just for those who can afford it. I could feel the energy in the room shifting. Some people were nodding along, caught up in the moment. Others looked uncomfortable, particularly the Mitchell and Associates crowd, who were hearing their former colleague essentially critique their entire business model. I want to thank Mayor Brennan for this opportunity, and I want to assure everyone here that I take this responsibility seriously. The city attorney's office will be transparent, accountable, and focused on serving all citizens of our community. More applause, stronger this time. I handed the microphone back to Mayor Brennan and stepped aside, my heart still racing. Thank you, Daniel. I'm confident you'll serve our city with distinction. She turned back to the crowd. The formal swearing-in ceremony will take place Monday morning at City Hall. Now please continue to enjoy the evening. The mayor stepped down from the podium, but instead of returning to her table, she approached me directly. Walk with me, she said quietly. We need to talk. We moved toward a quieter corner of the ballroom, away from the clusters of people who were already buzzing with speculation and gossip. I could feel eyes following us, and I could hear fragments of whispered conversations. I owe you an explanation, Mayor Brennan said when we were relatively alone. I know this seems sudden. Sudden is one word for it. I was starting to recover from the shock, but my mind was still reeling. How did this happen? When did this happen? Your name first came up about 6 weeks ago. David Richardson contacted my office directly, said there were some concerns about his current legal representation, and wondered if we knew any environmental lawyers who might be available for consultation. 6 weeks ago. That was well before tonight's party, before Richardson's seemingly casual conversation on the terrace. This had been in the works for longer than I'd realized. Richardson spoke very highly of your work on the Meridian case, the mayor continued. Said you were the most competent attorney he'd worked with, and that your departure from Mitchell and Associates was their loss. So we started asking around. Sarah Chen at the DA's office, Judge Martinez, who remembered your work on the Riverside Park lawsuit, several of the attorneys you've been working with on court-appointed cases. The mayor smiled. The consensus was unanimous. You're exactly what we're looking for. I thought about all those late nights over the past 8 months, taking on cases that barely paid the rent, defending people who couldn't afford lawyers like the ones in this room. I'd thought I was just surviving, just keeping my head above water. Apparently I'd been building a reputation. But what about the other firms? What about Mitchell and Associates? Mayor Brennan's expression darkened. About an hour ago, I received a call from opposing counsel in the Meridian Industries case. Apparently there's been a significant breach of discovery protocols. Key documents that should have been produced months ago have been withheld, potentially compromising the entire litigation. My stomach dropped. The documents Richardson had mentioned on the terrace, the internal memos and technical reports that were crucial to Meridian's defense. Someone at Mitchell and Associates had dropped the ball, and dropped it badly. The opposing attorneys are talking about sanctions, possibly even a malpractice suit. And Meridian Industries has already fired Mitchell and Associates and hired new counsel. She paused. Your old firm is about to face the kind of scandal that could destroy their reputation. I glanced across the room toward Richard Mitchell, who was huddled in intense conversation with several of his partners. His face was flushed, and he kept gesturing angrily. Word was clearly starting to spread. So when Richardson recommended you for the city attorney position, the mayor continued, and when everyone else we talked to confirmed that you were the right person for the job, the decision became obvious. We need someone with integrity, someone we can trust completely. Recent events have only reinforced that decision. The irony was staggering. 8 months ago, Richard Mitchell had fired me to cut costs and improve the firm's bottom line. Now that same decision was coming back to destroy him, while elevating me to one of the most prominent legal positions in the city. There's something else you should know, Mayor Brennan said. The Meridian case isn't the only problem they're facing. My office has been investigating several complaints about Mitchell and Associates' handling of municipal contracts. Nothing criminal, but enough ethical questions to make us very uncomfortable about a potential partnership. What kind of ethical questions? Billing irregularities, missed deadlines, cases where junior associates were doing work that clients were told would be handled by senior partners. She shook her head, the kind of corner cutting that happens when a firm gets too big and too focused on profits. I thought about my years at Mitchell and Associates, the pressure to bill more hours, to take on more cases, to generate more revenue. I'd watched the firm grow from a respected boutique practice to a corporate machine, and I'd seen how that growth had changed the culture. Quality work became secondary to quantity billing. Client service became less important than client acquisition. So what happens now? I asked. Now you become the city attorney. Mayor Brennan smiled. Your first case will probably be dealing with the mess your old firm left behind. Poetic justice, don't you think? Across the room, I could see the party beginning to break up. Some people were heading for the exits, probably eager to spread the news of the evening's dramatic turn. Others were clustering around Richard Mitchell and his partners, no doubt offering sympathy and trying to assess how the firm's troubles might affect their own interests. Jennifer Walsh caught my eye from across the room. For a moment, she looked like she might approach, but then she seemed to think better of it and turned away. Marcus Rodriguez was already gone, probably rushing home to update his LinkedIn profile and start reaching out to other firms. Daniel. The mayor's voice brought my attention back. I know this is overwhelming. Take the weekend to process everything. We'll meet Monday morning before the swearing-in ceremony to discuss your priorities and transition plan. Thank you, Mayor Brennan. I won't let you down. I know you won't. That's why you got the job. She shook my hand and moved back toward her table, leaving me standing alone in the corner of the ballroom. But it was a different kind of alone than I'd felt earlier in the evening. Then, I'd been isolated, invisible, irrelevant. Now, I was alone because I was processing one of the biggest moments of my career. Daniel Thompson, city attorney. I said the words quietly to myself, testing how they sounded. City Attorney Daniel Thompson. It was going to take some getting used to. The evening wound down quickly after that. People began filtering out in small groups, their conversations animated with speculation about what they'd witnessed. I received a few congratulations from strangers, some curious looks from acquaintances, and careful distance from most of the Mitchell and Associates crowd. As I made my way toward the exit, Sarah Chen intercepted me near the coat check. Holy shit, Daniel. Her grin was infectious. Did you know? Did you have any idea? None whatsoever. This is incredible. You went from unemployed to city attorney in 8 months. That might be some kind of record. Sarah, I said, lowering my voice, what do you know about the Meridian situation? Her expression grew serious. Enough to know that Mitchell and Associates is in deep trouble. The DA's office has been getting calls all week from opposing counsel, from clients, from other firms. Word is spreading fast. How bad is it? Bad enough that Richard might lose his law license. Bad enough that the firm might not survive. She paused. Bad enough that everyone who worked there is going to be looking for new jobs very soon. As if summoned by our conversation, Richard Mitchell appeared at my elbow. His earlier confidence had evaporated completely, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like desperation. Thompson, his voice was strained. We need to talk. I don't think we do, Richard. Please, just 5 minutes. There are explanations. I looked at the man who'd fired me 8 months ago, who'd dismissed my years of service as a cost-saving measure, who'd spent the evening treating me like an unwelcome ghost at his celebration. Now he was looking at me like I held his future in my hands. Which, in a way, I suppose I did. Good luck with everything, Richard, I said quietly. I hope you land on your feet. I walked away, leaving him standing by the coat check with his mouth hanging open. Outside, the October night was crisp and clear, The valet brought my car, a 10-year-old Honda that looked distinctly out of place among the BMWs and Mercedes in the parking lot. But as I drove home through the familiar streets of DC, I found myself seeing them differently. These weren't just the streets where I lived and worked anymore. They were the streets I would be responsible for protecting, the community I would be serving as city attorney. Tomorrow, I would wake up and start preparing for a job I'd never imagined having. I would begin the process of cleaning up the mess left behind by my former firm. I would step into a role that would define the next phase of my career. But tonight, I allowed myself a moment of pure satisfaction. Tonight I had gone from invisible to indispensable. Tonight, the people who had dismissed me had learned that sometimes the person you overlook is exactly the person you needed most. Sometimes justice really does have a sense of irony. The headlines hit the legal community like a seismic shock on Monday morning. Metchell and Associates faces malpractice scandal ran across the top of the legal tribune. The Washington Post's business section led with prominent D.C. law firm Lowe's major client amid discovery violations. By noon, the story had spread to the national legal publications, and by evening, it was trending on legal Twitter. I read the coverage from my new office on the 7th floor of City Hall, a space that still felt surreal. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Potomac, and the mahogany desk was larger than my entire previous office. The nameplate reading Daniel Thompson, city attorney, sat prominently in the center, catching the morning light. My assistant, Eleanor Martinez, knocked and entered with a stack of newspapers and a steaming cup of coffee. She was a veteran of city government, having worked for 3 previous city attorneys, and her efficiency was already proving invaluable. "The vultures are circling," she said, setting the papers down. "I've had 17 calls from reporters since 8 o'clock, and it's not even noon yet." I scanned the headlines. The details were devastating for Mitchell and Associates. The Meridian Industries debacle had expanded beyond a simple discovery violation. Internal emails had surfaced showing that junior associates had raised concerns about missing documents months ago, only to be ignored by overwhelmed partners. Client communications revealed a pattern of missed deadlines and inadequate supervision across multiple cases. "Any word from the firm itself?" I asked. Radio silence. "Their main number goes straight to voicemail, and their website is down for maintenance." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Though I did hear from Patricia Hoffman. She's requesting a meeting." Patricia Hoffman, one of the junior partners who'd been discussing the Meridian disaster at the anniversary party. I remembered the stress in her voice, the fear in her eyes when she realized how badly they'd mishandled the case. "What does she want?" She wouldn't say over the phone, just that it was urgent and related to several city contracts. The intercom buzzed and Eleanor pressed the button. "Mr. Thompson's office." "Eleanor, it's Mayor Brennan. Is Daniel available? We need to discuss the Mitchell situation." "Send her in," I said. Mayor Brennan entered looking like she'd been up all night. Her usual composed demeanor showed cracks of exhaustion, and she carried a thick folder stuffed with documents. "How are you handling your first day as the most talked-about attorney in D.C.?" she asked, settling into one of the leather chairs across from my desk. "Still processing it all." "What's in the folder?" "The extent of our Mitchell and Associates problem." She opened the folder and spread documents across my desk. "Remember I mentioned we'd been investigating complaints? Well, it's worse than we thought." The documents painted a picture of systematic negligence. Contracts for the city's environmental review process had been mishandled, resulting in potential liability for several development projects. Municipal bond work had been delegated to first-year associates without proper oversight. Most troubling, several city ordinances had been drafted with legal errors that could invalidate them entirely. "How much are we talking about in terms of potential damages?" I asked. "Conservative estimate? $15 million. If some of these environmental violations result in federal sanctions, it could be double that." I leaned back in my chair, trying to process the scope of the disaster. This wasn't just about the Meridian case anymore. This was about years of corner-cutting and profit-maximizing that had compromised the city's legal position across multiple fronts. "There's more," Mayor Brennan said grimly. "I just got off the phone with Judge Martinez. She's concerned about several cases where Mitchell and Associates represented the city in court. Appeals might be necessary." My phone rang, interrupting the conversation. Eleanor's voice came through the speaker. Mr. Thompson, I have David Richardson on line 1. He says it's about the Meridian transition. I should take this, I told the mayor. Richardson's voice was strained when I picked up. Daniel, thank God. We need to meet immediately. The situation is evolving rapidly. What's happening? Meridian isn't the only client jumping ship. Word has spread through the corporate community, and Mitchell and Associates is hemorrhaging clients. But that's not the urgent part. What is? 3 other environmental cases they were handling have similar discovery problems. Same pattern: missing documents, inadequate preparation, junior associates overwhelmed by complex litigation. My colleagues at other companies are panicking. I felt a migraine beginning to form behind my eyes. How many cases are we talking about? At least 6 major environmental lawsuits, probably more. Companies that trusted Mitchell and Associates with bet the company litigation are realizing their cases might be compromised. Some are talking about switching counsel, others are considering settlement just to avoid the uncertainty, and they're all coming to you for recommendations. Daniel, they're not just asking for recommendations, they're asking for you specifically. Word has spread about your appointment as city attorney, about your background with these exact types of cases. I've had 4 CEOs call me this morning asking if you'd be available for consultation. The irony was almost overwhelming. 8 months ago, I couldn't get a call back from mid-tier firms. Now Fortune 500 companies were specifically requesting my services. I can't take on private clients while serving as city attorney. Conflict of interest. I know that. But you could recommend other attorneys, help with transitions, maybe serve as an expert witness in the inevitable malpractice suits. After Richardson hung up, I sat in silence for a moment, staring out at the Potomac. Mayor Brennan was watching me with a mixture of sympathy and calculation. Let me guess, she said. The corporate world has discovered that the attorney they overlooked is suddenly indispensable. Something like that. Daniel, I'm going to give you some advice that might sound cynical, but it comes from 20 years in politics. This moment, right now, is when you define your legacy. You can use this situation to benefit yourself, or you can use it to serve the city. But you can't do both. She was right, of course. The opportunities that were about to come my way could be financially lucrative beyond anything I'd imagined. Expert witness fees alone could dwarf my city attorney salary. But taking advantage of those opportunities would compromise my ability to serve the city effectively. What do you recommend? Focus on cleaning up the mess here first. Show the city that they made the right choice. Build a reputation for integrity and competence that will serve you for the rest of your career. She smiled. Trust me, the money will still be there later. Eleanor knocked and entered again. Mr. Thompson, Patricia Hoffman is here for her appointment. Send her in. Patricia entered looking like she'd aged a decade since Saturday night. Her usually perfect hair was disheveled, her business suit wrinkled, and there were dark circles under her eyes. She carried a banker's box that she set carefully on the floor beside her chair. Thank you for seeing me, Daniel. I know this is awkward. What can I do for you, Patricia? I want to make things right. She gestured toward the box. Those are copies of all the city-related files I worked on at Mitchell and Associates. Every contract, every piece of correspondence, every internal memo about city business. I exchanged glances with Mayor Brennan. That's quite a gesture. Why? Because I know what we did was wrong. The corner cutting, the inadequate supervision, the focus on billable hours over actual legal work. Patricia's voice was tight with emotion. I became a lawyer to help people, to serve the community. Instead, I spent 3 years billing hours and hoping nobody would notice that we were cutting corners. Patricia, I said gently, you know I can't represent you or the firm in any legal proceedings that might arise from this situation. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to make sure the city doesn't suffer because of our mistakes. She opened the box and pulled out a thick folder. This contains a summary of every potential legal problem we created for the city. Environmental violations, contract errors, missed deadlines, everything. Mayor Brennan leaned forward. How bad is it? Bad. The environmental review contracts alone could expose the city to federal sanctions. 3 major development projects were approved based on flawed legal analysis. And the municipal bond work, she shook her head. Some of those bonds might be legally invalid. The scope of the disaster kept expanding. What had started as a single case of discovery violations was revealing itself as a systematic failure of legal representation that could cost the city tens of millions of dollars. There's something else, Patricia continued. Richard is planning to fight this. He's hired crisis management consultants. He's preparing to blame everything on departing associates, and he's threatening to sue any clients who try to recover damages from the firm. Can he do that? He can try. The malpractice insurance will cover some of it. But if the damages are as extensive as they appear to be, the firm could be facing bankruptcy. After Patricia left, Mayor Brennan and I sat in contemplative silence. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the scattered documents that represented years of legal malpractice. So, the mayor said finally, how does it feel to inherit the biggest legal mess in the city's recent history on your first day as city attorney? Honestly, overwhelming. But also, I paused, searching for the right word. Clarifying. Clarifying. This is why I became a lawyer. Not to generate billable hours or maximize profits, but to solve problems, to protect people, to serve the community. I gestured at the documents spread across my desk. This is actual legal work. Complicated, messy, important work that will make a real difference in people's lives. Mayor Brennan smiled. That's exactly what I hoped you'd say. The rest of the afternoon was a blur of meetings, phone calls, and strategic planning. We assembled a team of outside counsel to help assess the damage from Mitchell and Associates' negligence. We began the process of reviewing every city contract the firm had touched. We started preparing for what would likely be months of litigation and negotiation. As the sun set over the Potomac, I found myself alone in my office, surrounded by boxes of files and stacks of legal documents. My phone had been ringing constantly, reporters seeking comments, attorneys offering assistance, corporate executives hoping for consultations. But for the first time in months, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The knock on my door was soft, almost tentative. Eleanor had left hours ago, and the building was mostly empty. Come in. To my surprise, it was Jennifer Walsh from Mitchell and Associates. She looked nervous, uncertain, nothing like the confident litigator I remembered. I hope you don't mind me stopping by. Security let me up, because I told them we used to work together. What can I do for you, Jennifer? I wanted to apologize. For Saturday night, for how everyone treated you. She gestured helplessly. For everything. You don't need to apologize. Yes, I do. We all knew you were good at your job. We all knew letting you go was a mistake. But we were so caught up in the firm's success, so focused on our own careers, that we didn't speak up. She sat down across from me, her usual confidence replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse. The firm is finished, isn't it? She asked. I don't know. That's not really my concern anymore. What is your concern? I looked out the window at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering darkness, making sure this never happens again, making sure the city gets the legal representation it deserves, making sure that justice isn't just for people who can afford it. Jennifer nodded slowly. For what it's worth, I think they made the right choice. After she left, I sat alone in my office, processing the surreal events of the past 3 days. Saturday night, I'd been an invisible outsider at my former firm's celebration, dismissed and forgotten by people who'd once been my colleagues. Tonight, I was the city attorney responsible for protecting an entire community, tasked with cleaning up a legal disaster that would define my early tenure in the position. It wasn't the career path I'd planned, but sometimes the most important journeys are the ones we never see coming. Outside my window, the city hummed with life, people heading home from work, restaurants filling with dinner crowds, theaters preparing for evening shows. All of them count on the legal system to protect their rights, to ensure fairness, to provide justice. Tomorrow, the real work will begin. 3 weeks into my tenure as city attorney, the Mitchell and Associates implosion had become a case study taught at law schools across the country. Harvard Business Review wanted to interview me about crisis management. The American Bar Association asked me to speak at their ethics conference. Legal recruiters called daily, with offers that would triple my salary. But none of that mattered as much as the phone call I received on Thursday morning from Detective Luis Ramirez of the Metropolitan Police Department. Mr. Thompson, we need to talk. It's about the Riverside Development Project. I knew the Riverside Development case intimately. I'd worked on the initial environmental assessments back at Mitchell and Associates before my termination. It was a massive mixed-use project on the banks of the Potomac, with luxury condos, retail space, and a public park. The kind of development that could revitalize a neglected neighborhood or destroy it completely, depending on how it was managed. What's the problem, detective? We have reason to believe there may have been criminal activity related to the environmental approvals, falsified documents, bribery, obstruction of justice. The kind of things that go way beyond malpractice. My blood ran cold. Criminal activity meant federal prosecutors would get involved. It meant potential prison sentences for anyone who'd participated. It meant the legal disaster I'd inherited was about to get exponentially worse. I'll be right over. The police station was a 20-minute drive from City Hall, but it felt like hours. My mind raced through the implications of Ramirez's call. If criminal charges were filed, every contract Mitchell and Associates had touched would be suspect. Every approval they'd secured would be questioned. The city's legal exposure could reach into the hundreds of millions. Detective Ramirez was a compact man in his 50s with graying hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. His office was cramped but organized, with case files stacked neatly on every available surface. "Here's what we know," he said, spreading photographs across his desk. 3 months ago, we started investigating complaints about the Riverside Development Project. Neighbors reported that construction crews were working at night, dumping materials into storm drains, activities that weren't covered by their permits. The photographs showed construction equipment operating in darkness, trucks dumping what appeared to be construction debris, and workers in hazmat suits handling unmarked containers. Initially, we thought it was just corner cutting by the construction company. But then we started digging deeper. Ramirez pulled out another folder, the environmental impact assessment that approved this project. It was based on soil samples that were never actually taken. What do you mean? I mean, someone submitted lab results for soil samples that don't exist. The testing dates correspond to days when the testing company's equipment was being serviced. The lab technician who allegedly signed off on the results was on vacation in Mexico. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Environmental fraud was a federal crime, punishable by years in prison. If Mitchell and Associates had been involved in falsifying environmental assessments, how extensive is this? I asked. That's what we're trying to figure out. But it's not just Riverside. We found similar irregularities in at least 4 other major development projects that Mitchell and Associates handled for the city. Ramirez pulled out a timeline that mapped the various projects against key dates at the law firm. The pattern was disturbing. The environmental shortcuts seemed to accelerate during the same period when the firm was aggressively expanding and taking on more cases than they could properly handle. Detective, I need to ask you something, and I want you to understand that I'm asking as the city attorney, not as someone who used to work at Mitchell and Associates. Go ahead. Do you have any evidence that the attorneys themselves knew about the falsified documents, or is it possible they were just negligent in their oversight? Ramirez's expression was grim. That's the million-dollar question. We found email chains that suggest at least some of the partners knew the environmental reviews were being fast-tracked. Whether they knew they were fraudulent, he shrugged. That's what we're investigating. I left the police station with a sick feeling in my stomach. If criminal charges were filed against Mitchell and Associates, it would validate every decision I'd made since leaving the firm. But it would also mean that people I'd worked alongside for years, people I'd considered friends, might be facing federal prison sentences. Back at City Hall, I found Eleanor fielding a crisis. My afternoon was packed with emergency meetings. The mayor at 2 o'clock, the city council president at 3, and a conference call with federal prosecutors at 4. Also, Eleanor said, consulting her notes, Marcus Rodriguez called. He wants to meet about something urgent. And Richard Mitchell's secretary called to request a meeting, though she wouldn't say what it was about. Marcus Rodriguez, my former colleague who'd barely acknowledged me at the anniversary party, was now calling for urgent meetings. The transformation in people's attitudes toward me over the past 3 weeks had been remarkable, and not always in ways that made me comfortable. Schedule Rodriguez for tomorrow morning. What about Mitchell? I told them you'd get back to them. Do you want to meet with him? It was a good question. Richard Mitchell was now a potential subject of a criminal investigation. Meeting with him could create ethical complications, conflicts of interest, or worse. On the other hand, if he had information that could help the city protect itself, I had an obligation to hear it. Set up a meeting for Friday afternoon, make sure our staff attorney is present, and document everything. The meeting with Mayor Brennan was tense. She'd already heard about the police investigation through her own channels, and she was clearly concerned about the political implications. "How bad is this going to get?" she asked. "If the criminal allegations are true, catastrophic. We're not just talking about civil liability anymore. We're talking about years of city approvals that might be invalid, construction projects that might need to be shut down, environmental remediation that could cost hundreds of millions. And if they're not true, then we're dealing with the largest legal malpractice case in the city's history, which is still pretty catastrophic." The mayor rubbed her temples. "What do you need from me?" "Authority to hire outside counsel specializing in federal criminal defense, authority to cooperate fully with the FBI investigation, and authority to begin the process of reviewing every single contract and approval Mitchell and Associates handled for the city over the past 5 years. You have it. What else? I need you to understand that this is going to get worse before it gets better. The media attention is going to be intense. There will be political pressure to find scapegoats, to minimize the city's liability, to make deals that might not be in the public's best interest." Mayor Brennan leaned back in her chair, studying me carefully. "And you're telling me this because I need to know that you'll support doing the right thing, even if it's politically expensive, even if it means admitting that the city made mistakes, that we trusted the wrong people, that taxpayers are going to have to pay for those mistakes." "Daniel, 3 weeks ago I gambled my political career on hiring an unknown attorney who'd been fired from his previous job. I did it because I believed you were someone who would put the public interest ahead of personal or political considerations." She smiled grimly. "I'm not going to change my mind now." The conference call with federal prosecutors was even more sobering. Special Agent Catherine Walsh, no relation to Jennifer Walsh, as she made clear, was leading the investigation, and she painted a picture of systematic fraud that went far beyond what Detective Ramirez had described. "We've identified at least 12 development projects where environmental assessments appear to have been falsified," she said, her voice crackling through the speakerphone. "The pattern suggests a coordinated effort to fast-track approvals for projects that should never have been approved." "Do you have evidence linking Mitchell and Associates directly to the falsification?" I asked. "We have evidence that they submitted fraudulent documents to the city. Whether they knew the documents were fraudulent is still under investigation. But even if they didn't know, their negligence in reviewing the materials they submitted could constitute criminal negligence." The call lasted for over an hour, covering everything from potential plea bargains to witness protection for whistleblowers. By the time it ended, I felt like I'd aged a decade. Eleanor knocked and entered as I was staring out the window at the Potomac, trying to process the magnitude of what I'd learned. "Mr. Thompson, there's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent and can't wait until tomorrow." "Who is it?" "Sarah Chen from the DA's office. She looks pretty shaken up." Sarah entered my office carrying a manila envelope and wearing an expression I'd never seen before. Pure panic. "Daniel, we need to talk, off the record, between friends about something that could change everything." "What's going on?" She opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of photocopied documents. "These came to our office through an anonymous tip 3 hours ago. They're internal emails from Mitchell and Associates, dating back 2 years." I took the documents and began reading. The first email was from Richard Mitchell to his partners, discussing the firm's financial pressures and the need to streamline our review processes to remain competitive. The second was more explicit. "We need to focus on billable hours and client satisfaction. Environmental reviews are taking too long and costing us money." But it was the third email that made my hands shake. It was from Patricia Hoffman to Richard Mitchell, marked confidential, and dated 6 months before my termination. "Richard, the environmental assessments for Riverside and Harbor Point projects have significant gaps. The testing data doesn't match our client's timeline, and some of the lab results seem inconsistent. Should we flag this for the client or proceed with submission? We're already 3 weeks behind schedule, and the client is threatening to find new counsel." Patricia Richards' response was brief and damning. "Submit the assessments as received. Client deadlines take priority. We can address any issues in post-approval modifications if necessary. Sarah, I said quietly, where did these come from? Anonymous tip, like I said. But Daniel, there's more. The tip included a phone number and instructions to call if we wanted additional documentation. Did you call? I did. The voice was electronically disguised, but whoever it was claimed to have hundreds of similar emails, internal memos, billing records, everything. They want to meet. This is evidence in a federal criminal investigation. It needs to go to the FBI immediately. I know, but they specifically asked to meet with you first, said they had information about your role in all this that you needed to hear before it became public. My role in all this, the phrase sent a chill down my spine. I'd worked on several of the projects mentioned in the emails, I'd reviewed environmental assessments, prepared legal memoranda, and advised the city on approval processes. If criminal charges were filed, would I be considered a witness, a victim, or something worse? When and where do they want to meet? Tomorrow night 8 p.m. at the coffee shop below your old office. They said you'd understand the significance. The coffee shop below my old office. The place where I'd spent countless hours after leaving Mitchell and Associates, working on court-appointed cases, trying to rebuild my career. The place where I'd learned to practice law again, to remember why I'd become an attorney in the first place. Are you going? Sarah asked. I looked out the window at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering darkness. Somewhere out there, construction crews were working on projects approved through potentially fraudulent environmental assessments. Somewhere, executives were making decisions based on legal advice that might have been compromised from the beginning. Somewhere, federal agents were building a case that could send people I'd once called colleagues to prison. And somewhere, an anonymous whistleblower was waiting to tell me something about my own role in the biggest legal scandal in the city's recent history. Yes, I said finally, I'm going. Sarah nodded grimly. Daniel, whatever you find out tomorrow night, whatever role you played or didn't play in this mess, remember one thing: you're not the same person who worked at Mitchell and Associates. You've become something better. After she left, I sat alone in my office, staring at the emails that could destroy the careers of people I'd once considered friends. In 3 weeks, I'd gone from invisible to indispensable, from unemployed to city attorney, from victim to potential witness in a federal criminal investigation. But tomorrow night's meeting would determine whether I was also something else entirely, a participant in the very corruption I was now charged with investigating. The coffee shop below my old office looked exactly the same as it had 8 months ago. Mismatched furniture, local art on the walls, the perpetual aroma of roasted beans and determination. But sitting in the corner booth where I'd once spent countless hours rebuilding my career, I felt like a completely different person. At exactly 8 p.m., a woman approached my table. She was in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and the kind of unremarkable appearance that would make her instantly forgettable in a crowd. Perfect for an anonymous whistleblower. Mr. Thompson? Her voice was steady, but I could see the nervousness in her eyes. Thank you for coming. You have me at a disadvantage. You know who I am, but my name is Amanda Foster. I was a paralegal at Mitchell and Associates for 4 years. Until last week, when I was fired for asking too many questions. Amanda Foster. The name was vaguely familiar. I'd probably seen it on internal emails or case files, but we'd never worked directly together. She sat down across from me, placing a large envelope on the table between us. I need you to understand something before we begin, she said. I didn't come forward out of spite or revenge. I came forward because what they did, what we all participated in, was wrong, and it's going to hurt innocent people if it continues. What do you mean by what we all participated in? Amanda opened the envelope and pulled out a thick stack of documents. For the past 2 years, Mitchell and Associates has been systematically falsifying environmental impact assessments to expedite development approvals. They've been billing clients for reviews that were never conducted, submitting reports based on fabricated data, and covering up environmental violations that could endanger public health. She handed me the first document, an internal memo from Richard Mitchell dated 18 months ago. The subject line read, Operational Efficiency Initiative, Environmental Division. This memo went out to all senior staff, Amanda continued. It outlined new procedures for streamlining environmental reviews, shorter timelines, reduced testing requirements, standardized report templates that could be used across multiple projects with minimal customization. I scanned the memo, my stomach sinking with each paragraph. The language was carefully crafted to avoid explicitly ordering fraud, but the message was clear: speed and profitability were more important than accuracy or compliance. Amanda, this is evidence in a federal criminal investigation. Why are you showing it to me instead of going directly to the FBI? Because you're mentioned in several of these documents, and not in the way you might expect. She pulled out another set of papers, email printouts with my name highlighted in yellow throughout. I recognized some of them immediately: objections I'd raised about rushed environmental assessments, requests for additional testing that had been denied, warnings about potential liability issues that had been ignored. Daniel, you were the only attorney at the firm who consistently pushed back against the shortcuts. You questioned incomplete reports, demanded additional testing, and refused to sign off on assessments you considered inadequate. I remembered those battles. The heated arguments with Richard Mitchell about proper due diligence. The late nights I'd spent reviewing environmental data that other attorneys would have rubber-stamped. The growing tension between my commitment to legal ethics and the firm's pressure to prioritize profits. Is that why I was really fired? I asked. Amanda nodded grimly. The official reason was downsizing, but these internal emails tell a different story. Richard and the other partners were frustrated with your inflexibility and your inability to adapt to new operational priorities. They saw you as an obstacle to their streamlined approach. She handed me another document, an email from Richard Mitchell to the other partners, dated 1 week before my termination. Thompson continues to create delays and complications in our environmental practice. His insistence on comprehensive reviews is costing us clients and revenue. We need to consider whether his approach is compatible with our firm's direction. Reading those words, I felt a strange mixture of vindication and sadness. Vindication because my termination hadn't been about my competence or value to the firm. It had been about my refusal to compromise my professional standards. Sadness because I realized how completely the firm's culture had changed from the principled practice I'd once been proud to join. There's more, Amanda said. After you left, the environmental shortcuts accelerated dramatically. Without your voice raising concerns, the other attorneys fell in line with the new procedures. The Riverside development project that the police are investigating. The environmental assessment was completed in 3 days using a template from a completely different type of development in another state. 3 days? A proper assessment for a project that size should take months. I know. I was the paralegal assigned to coordinate the review. When I raised concerns about the timeline, I was told that efficiency was a priority, and that I should focus on administrative tasks rather than substantive legal issues. Amanda pulled out her phone and showed me a recording app. I started recording conversations about 6 months ago, when it became clear that the firm was engaging in potentially criminal activity. I have dozens of hours of recordings. Partners discussing how to hide inadequate reviews, associates being pressured to sign off on incomplete work, clients being misled about the scope of environmental assessments. Amanda, you could be in serious legal jeopardy yourself if you participated in preparing fraudulent documents. I know, but I'd rather face the consequences of telling the truth than live with the knowledge that I helped cover up environmental crimes that could hurt innocent people. She leaned forward intently. Daniel, the Riverside Development Project was built on contaminated soil, real contaminated soil, not the clean fill that the environmental assessment claimed. The developer knew it, the construction company knew it, and at least some people at Mitchell and Associates knew it. The implications hit me like a physical blow. If residential units had been built on contaminated soil, the health consequences for residents could be devastating. Cancer, birth defects, neurological disorders, the kind of long-term harm that might not manifest for years, but could affect hundreds of families. How do you know the soil was contaminated? Because I have the real test results, the ones that were never submitted to the city. She pulled out a manila folder containing laboratory reports, high levels of lead, mercury, and industrial solvents. the kind of contamination that would require extensive remediation before any residential construction could begin. I stared at the test results, my mind racing through the legal and ethical implications. If Amanda was right, Mitchell and Associates hadn't just committed fraud, they'd been complicit in creating a public health crisis. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "I want you to make sure this information gets to the right people. The FBI, the EPA, the families who might be living in contaminated housing. I want you to use your position as city attorney to protect the people this firm puts at risk." "Amanda, I have to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Are you absolutely certain that I wasn't involved in any of the fraudulent activities? Because if there's any possibility that I unknowingly participated, Daniel, you're the reason I decided to come forward. When I was researching the firm's environmental cases, I found dozens of instances where you had identified problems, raised concerns, and tried to prevent exactly the kind of corners that were cut after you left. You weren't part of the problem. You were the solution they got rid of." She reached into the envelope one more time and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "This is a copy of your final performance review at Mitchell and Associates, the one that was never shared with you." I took the document with trembling hands. The performance review, signed by Richard Mitchell, was devastating in its honesty. Thompson is an excellent attorney with strong technical skills and unwavering ethical standards. However, his reluctance to adapt to our firm's evolving operational needs has created friction with clients and colleagues. While his legal work is exemplary, his inflexibility regarding review timelines and procedural requirements is incompatible with our current business model. "They fired you because you were too ethical," Amanda said quietly, "and they replaced you with attorneys who were willing to do whatever the clients wanted, regardless of the legal or moral consequences." We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of the revelations settling between us. Outside the coffee shop window, the city hummed with its usual evening energy, people heading home from work, couples going to dinner, families spending time together. None of them aware that their city attorney was learning about environmental crimes that could affect their health, their homes, their futures. "What happens now?" Amanda asked. "Now I do my job. I turn this evidence over to federal prosecutors. I cooperate fully with their investigation, and I work to protect the city and its residents from the consequences of Mitchell and Associates' actions. And the people who might be living in contaminated housing, they'll be notified immediately. The city will provide alternative housing if necessary, medical monitoring for anyone who might have been exposed, and full remediation of any contaminated properties." Amanda nodded, relief visible on her face for the first time since she'd sat down. "Thank you. I know this puts you in a difficult position." "No," I said, gathering the documents. "This puts me in exactly the position I'm supposed to be in, between the people who need protection and the people who would harm them for profit." 3 hours later, I was sitting in the FBI field office, watching Special Agent Catherine Walsh review Amanda's evidence. The fluorescent lights were harsh, the coffee was terrible, and the magnitude of the federal investigation was becoming clearer with each document she examined. "Thompson, based on this evidence, we're looking at potential charges of mail fraud, wire fraud, environmental crimes, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. This isn't just a civil matter anymore. We're talking about felony charges that could result in decades in prison for the participants. What about the people who might have been harmed by the contaminated housing? EPA teams will begin testing tomorrow morning. If contamination is confirmed, we'll work with local health authorities to ensure residents receive appropriate medical care and relocation assistance." Agent Walsh set down the documents and looked at me directly. "I have to ask you this officially. Did you have any knowledge of or participation in the fraudulent environmental assessments described in these materials?"
No.
"In fact, the evidence suggests that my objections to inadequate reviews were one of the reasons I was terminated. That's consistent with what we're seeing. In fact, your departure from the firm seems to have been the catalyst for the acceleration of fraudulent activities." She paused. "Mr. Thompson, we may need you to testify against your former colleagues." The thought of testifying against people I'd once worked alongside, people I'd considered friends, was deeply unsettling. But the alternative, allowing them to escape accountability for crimes that could harm innocent families, was worse. "I'll testify to whatever I witnessed or experienced. The people of this city deserve the truth." 6 months later, I stood at the podium in the same ballroom where my life had changed so dramatically. But this time, I wasn't an invisible outsider watching from the margins. I was the keynote speaker at the annual Municipal Attorneys Conference, addressing colleagues from across the country about ethics, accountability, and the responsibility of public service. The Mitchell and Associates case, I told the assembled attorneys, reminds us that our profession's highest calling isn't maximizing profits or impressing clients. It's protecting the vulnerable, serving the public interest, and ensuring that justice isn't just for those who can afford it. In the audience, I could see faces I recognized, some supportive, others skeptical, all of them grappling with the implications of a case that had sent shockwaves through the legal community. Richard Mitchell was serving 18 months in federal prison. 3 other partners had received similar sentences. The firm itself had dissolved, unable to survive the criminal prosecutions and civil lawsuits. But the real victory wasn't in the prosecutions or the professional consequences. It was in the families who had been relocated from contaminated housing, the environmental remediation that was restoring damaged neighborhoods, and the new oversight procedures that would prevent similar crimes in the future. 10 months ago, I continued, I was fired from a prestigious law firm for being too inflexible, too concerned with procedural requirements, too unwilling to prioritize profits over principles. Today, I'm here to tell you that those aren't flaws. They're the essential qualities that distinguish lawyers from mere technicians. After the speech, as I stood at the reception answering questions from colleagues, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The anniversary party that had seemed like such a humiliating experience had actually been the catalyst for the most important work of my career. Sometimes the moments that feel like endings are actually beginnings. Sometimes the people who dismiss you are doing you the greatest favor of your life. And sometimes justice really does have a sense of irony, turning the invisible into the indispensable, the overlooked into the essential, the fired into the hero. As I drove home through the familiar streets of D.C., I realized that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Not because of the prestigious title or the important cases, or the professional recognition, but because I had found my true calling protecting people, serving the community, and ensuring that the law works for everyone, not just those who can afford the best representation. The city lights twinkled in my rearview mirror as I headed home, ready for whatever challenges tomorrow would bring. Because now I knew something I hadn't understood 10 months ago. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's becoming everything they said you couldn't be. And sometimes the person they overlooked is exactly the person they needed most. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.